And at least as of right now, you're beating my Buckeyes from Ohio. You guys are like number 3 right now, so congratulations in football. But it's good to come here. We'll stop by the Creamery if we get some time. Although, give it a couple weeks. Give it a couple weeks, and we'll see if we settle the score. Exactly. You can express yourselves. That's good. I like the shirt. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. So I want to actually take most of the time for Q&A, and I'm sorry for people who are watching on the live stream. They told me about 250 people we had to turn away, and I hate when that happens, so we're going to work on happened the other night at Ohio State at the future tours of expanding the number of people we're able to accommodate. But to those on the live stream and the overflow room, thanks for bearing with us. I'll tell you a bit about my own story, which I don't always talk about from a political perspective. I'll tell you what I've learned and why I ended up stepping down from my job as a CEO eventually to enter this realm of politics. And it's a few things I've learned along the way, and then we're just going to open this up and have a conversation tonight. My parents came to this country. They came to Cincinnati, Ohio, as legal immigrants about 40 years ago with no money. And I went to a relatively rough public school system through about 8th grade. It wasn't abnormal for a kid to show up in junior high school with a knife. My parents decided for high school that they were going to switch me to St. X High School in Cincinnati, so I had a good Jesuit high school education before I went to Harvard for college, studied biology, thought I was going to be a scientist. Ended up joining the world of hedge funds, actually, after I graduated. Turned out my time in the lab, I don't know if any have any science majors by show of hands in the room. A few of you, a good number of you. For me, at least, the time in the lab was a little bit too long as a percentage of your life to discover a new medicine, too many reps that it would take, although I admire the people for whom that's the right work. I ended up getting into the world of biotech investing, did that for 3 years. Ended up having an itch to study law and political philosophy, actually, and took my way to law school while I kept my job. So I told my bosses I was going to, I was good. It's been a good 3 years. My learning curve's flattened. And something funny happened is actually when I told them I was going to leave to go to law school, they said, hey, how about you keep your job? You can just manage a portfolio for us from New Haven if you want to. I said, yeah, that sounds like a great deal. Those ended up being my most 3 productive years as an investor. And so as a matter of life advice, one of the things that I now tell people in your shoes is think of your career in 3-year increments. Make sure you're forcing yourself to make a change. But when you push yourself in a work environment, turns out good things can happen that are actually pretty unexpected. Those ended up being very lucrative years in law school, but also years that I ended up actually appreciating some of the questions relating to political debates that I end up in today, surrounded at Yale Law School by mostly liberal classmates, except for J.D. Vance. He was my classmate as well, and two of us built a friendship there. But mostly people who challenge my own points of view. And I got to say, I got a better education because of it, more out of my money's worth. Ended up starting a biotech company after that, led that company as CEO for 7 years. It had its ups and downs. You're going to start a company. The very first drug we developed was a drug for Alzheimer's disease. Very high profile, huge potential, ended up failing, crushing me in my early 30s. But nonetheless, that company ended up developing 5 drugs that went on to become FDA approved. And that's a $10+ billion publicly traded company that has returned billions of dollars to shareholders about 10 years later. And one of the things I learned from that experience is, great, you can treat the biological cancer. But in my 7th year as CEO, this was in the summer of 2020, something interesting happened. I didn't have my eye on politics in the political sphere at all. In fact, building a company was so all-consuming that, in fact, it would have been a distraction for me to have anything to do with politics. I was disengaged for a lot of the elections, even 2012, even 2016. I didn't vote. It wasn't not something I'm proud of, but it just wasn't something I was particularly engaged with. In the summer of 2020, in May of 2020, George Floyd dies. It was, under unfortunate circumstances, no doubt. But there were riots, what were known as mostly peaceful protests, but actually violent riots across the country. And there was an expectation that I, as a biotech CEO, in fact, demands that I, as a biotech CEO, come out and do what every tech CEO and biotech CEO was doing at the time, which was to make a statement on behalf of BLM and ideally a financial contribution to go along with it. So I thought this was ridiculous. This had nothing to do with the business that I was leading, developing medicines for patients who needed them. And even more so, I always try to keep an open mind, but I looked at the content of the organization. On the front page of their website was a call to dismantle the nuclear family structure. So I refused to do it. Turned out that created a firestorm, including in my colleagues in the biotech industry. Fast forward another 6 months, and I basically had to face a choice. Either I could continue in my job as a prominent biotech and tech CEO in that sector and, toe the party line, say what needed to be said at a given time. Many of the other CEOs of other companies that I knew that signed on the dotted line of their statements, they didn't really believe in that stuff anyway, but they were ready to do it. So either I could do that and keep my, by then, finally, comfortable job as a CEO of a company that was out of startup mode, or I could actually speak my mind as a citizen. But I couldn't do it as a CEO because that would have an adverse impact on my company. So that's when I decided to step down from my job as a biotech CEO and start this journey that I never would have imagined at the time culminated in a presidential run. I wrote a book called Woke Inc. a few years ago, and that took me on a journey that really forced me to confront what my own convictions were. And I haven't talked about that book in a while, but I'll actually kick today off with the themes in that book, dated back 4 years ago, and then we'll open this up for a conversation. Because I think even if we've seen peak wokeness, and I do think that peak racial wokeness, at least in recent years, is probably behind us, I think it's important and instructive because a lot of the new trends that are coming up, from LGBTQ ideology to climate ideology, the same pattern still repeats itself. So the paradox of this movement is it began in the backdrop of a civil rights movement that said, you know what, we believe in a colorblind country. We believe that you should be judged not on the color of your skin, but on the content of your character and your contributions. That got turned on its head somewhere along the way and said that, you know what, if you actually aren't viewing somebody through the lens of their skin color, then that actually makes you a racist because you're against the anti-racist movement. Ibram Kendi famously wrote about a year before I published my book that the remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination, which ran against everything that Martin Luther King at least stood for in his famous I Have a Dream speech. And so I began to call this out, and one of the things we learned is the way this actually spread through our culture wasn't just bottom-up because these ideas were so persuasive. It spread through our culture because companies and economic actors effectively forced you to choose between either adopting this ideology or putting food on the dinner table. Forced you to make the choice between the First Amendment and the American dream. And against the backdrop, especially of younger people who are growing up in a condition of economic hardship, an American dream that was promised to you but may not be reachable. 4-year college degrees for a gender studies major in California, unable to get a job with a load of college debt on their shoulders. You can't afford to take the risk of speaking your mind freely, or you might not get that job. You might get a bad grade in school. You might become an outcast in your own community. And so it became a new culture of fear that spread by force in the United States. And to me, that was un-American. I mean, this is the country on earth that doesn't force you to choose between speaking your mind and putting food on the dinner table. America is the nation where you get to do both of those things at once. And one of the things that happened is this little woke trend. How does this relate to our geopolitics? You got China, and they've been mastered this for the last several years, has taken advantage of this and laughing at us every step of the way. Because what China did is with those same companies that were effectively telling you that you can't speak your mind in the United States, or if you fail to say the wrong thing, you're a racist, and the United States is a systemically racist nation. Don't say a peep about the actual human rights atrocities in China. The same companies like BlackRock, Nike, Airbnb, you go straight down the list. The companies that put a nice little black square on their Instagram account had nothing to say about actual human rights atrocities in places like Xinjiang in China, which over the last several years, you've watched this happen, creates a false moral equivalence between the United States and China. When the arbiters of moral justice are our universities, are our great American corporations or financial institutions like BlackRock, that will force companies like Chevron to cut their emissions in the name of fighting global climate change without doing the same thing to PetroChina. That'll tell U.S. companies, if you criticize the CCP, you can't do business here. But if you criticize the United States, we'll roll out the red carpet. That then created a false moral equivalence between the United States and China. And so much of our geopolitics, both what's going on the global stage vis-a-vis China, as well as what's going on with our crisis of self-confidence here at home, came through the spread of this woke ideology, and more recently, this climate ideology through the economy. And I bring that up because it's a little bit, I mean, it's the first of 4 books I've written. That's what that first book was about. But I bring it up to a college audience because it's still relevant to all of you. You're going to face a choice as you grow up and age into an economy, join the workforce after you graduate, where that American dream that I lived isn't quite as available to you as it was to me at the time I graduated from college. I think that's actually true. I think it's a lot harder for you if you're graduating from college right now, just economically in the conditions you're facing. I think the cultural environment that you're growing up in is a lot more challenging than the college cultural environment that I grew up in. Places like Harvard and Yale, they've always leaned left. And as I told you, I got a better education because I was challenged. But right now, something altogether has happened, certainly with those institutions. And I don't have a great sense of the campus environment here, but I imagine some of the same issues exist as well, where it's not just a matter of a liberal bias, but a culture of intolerance for dissent, where in the name of diversity, we've actually sacrificed true diversity of thought. In the name of equity, we've actually sacrificed true equality of opportunity. And in the name of inclusion, we've created this new culture of exclusion, where certain points of view just aren't welcome. And so my message to you is I would love to come in here and tell you the American dream is alive and well, and my story achieved a generation before yours is every bit as possible for you to live up to. But that would be a bit of a lie, because I actually think the path paved for you is a lot harder than the one I had to take. But I'm going to ask you nonetheless to muster the courage to make decisions even harder than the ones I had to make, like the one I stepped down from my job as a biotech CEO. Because right now, our future of our country depends on it. Our founding fathers, they were not that much older than the people who are in this room. I'm looking around, actually. Alexander Hamilton was about 20 years old. Thomas Jefferson was 33, maybe older than most of you. He was younger than me. Even when I ran for president, I was 37 as the youngest person in U.S. history to do it. Jefferson was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence that set the whole ballgame into motion. These are young guys who did it too. And I think it's going to take, I think 2024 feels to me like a 1776 moment, which puts you in the generation of effectively the generation our founding fathers were in back in 1776, where you're going to have to make a sacrifice. And they faced a choice, right? Because they had every reason, just as your road ahead, I think, is a hard road ahead for you. Well, they had a hard road ahead for them, too. They could have been victims. They had every reason to view themselves as victims of the British monarchy that taxed them without representation or whatever else. But they didn't choose to be victims. They chose to be victorious. And when I think about what does it mean to be a conservative today, that's one of the dilemmas we got to confront. I preach this message to the left. I preach it to my kids. I preach it to young people, but we ought to swallow our own medicine, eat our own cooking in the conservative movement as well. The number one person, the number one factor responsible for whether you achieve what you want to in your life, not the only factor, but the number one factor that determines whether or not you achieve your goal in life is actually you. And I preached that to the woke left for years. That was the premise of my book, Woking, the idea that you're born with black skin or in a female gender or of a different sexual orientation. No, that's not an impediment to you achieving anything that you can with your own hard work and dedication and the gifts you've been given. I preached that to the left, but I feel like now is a moment where we all deserve to remember that, where are we playing on an even playing field headed into this election? We're not. Is the even playing field, is the marketplace of ideas an even playing field for conservatives versus liberals? Absolutely not. Like, it's definitely not. You are definitely taking a greater risk if you say something as banal as the fact that there are two genders, period, which I believe is a biological and scientific reality. If I said this 30 years ago, it would have been banal and you'd be booing me out of here because why are you bothering to say this? Today it's too controversial to say and may put you at risk for getting censored on social media or not being able to get a job. So is it an even playing field? No, it's not. But I want to make sure that we don't fall into the same trap that our friends on the left fell into over the last 20 years, which is just to see ourselves as victims as a consequence. We are not victims. We are victors. That's who we are as Americans. Hardship is not the same thing as victimhood. Hardship is something that happens to you in your life. I brought up even briefly the early example of that first drug we tried to develop at my company. It was crushing. But we were stronger for it on the other side and ended up having major success on the back of it. Because hardship is something that happens to you, but victimhood is a choice. And I think right now, 20 days out from this election, which I do think that it's not a political speech, of course, there's a different context for that, but nationally, we're in the context of an election here. Yes, there's an important election 20 days out. I feel really good about what the outcome could be, and I think it's going to be decided by this state in Pennsylvania, so I encourage everybody here to register, get the heck out there and vote, and get your parents to do the same thing, too. Spending time in this state for a reason. But on the other side of that, and when we wake up on November 6th, and I pray to God it will be on November 6th rather than like November 30th or something when we find out who won this election. I think it could be so decisive this time around that a landslide minus some shenanigans is still going to be a victory. That's honestly what I feel in my heart. But when we do wake up on the other side of that, I think we have a chance to then turn the page and say, all right, we had our turn being censored, being on the victim side of this new oppression. But we're not going to take the road to the left and wallow in our oppression. We're going to emerge victorious, and we're going to lead the entire country as one nation. I don't care black or white, left or right, as one nation, as the United States of America, back to who we were at our founding. And that's up to all of you. And that's why I'm here today, guys. So thank you for the warm welcome. Let's open this up, and let's have a conversation, guys. As many questions we can get to in the next hour, and then we're going to rock and roll. I think just come up is the... I know there's people sitting in the. I'm not supposed to say that if that's a fire code violation, but make your way to the front and hey, one thing, if there's people who have more dissenting questions, find your way to the front. All right, I take friendly questions too, but if you really have a good dissenting question, we want more of those than not. All right, we'll start with you. It's like surfing here, body surfing. Here, give it to that guy. Let's kick it off.
I have a few questions, some unrelated to politics. My name is Graham. I'm 18 years old.
Just give this man some courtesy, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a few questions that are a little bit unrelated to politics, some related to politics. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely. Just give me your best one, just to give respect to everybody behind you. Yep.
Got you. Well, my name is Graham. I'm 18 years old. I'm on my way to $10,000 a month with my business. I just got to
I love that.
As an entrepreneur, what separates the billionaires like you from the 9- and 8-figure entrepreneurs?
Well, some of it's age, man. It takes a little bit of time, but I've gotten there a little faster than most. Here would be my best advice to you. If the pack is running in one direction, run the other way. Make sure you're actually right. And that's the easy part. The hard part is when you think you're running the other way, most of the time you're actually still chasing the pack. See, everybody thinks they're being original when, in fact, you got to wake up and smell the roses around you. Turns out if everybody else is actually kind of going the same way, if it doesn't feel like you've got some major arrows coming your way, you're probably actually chasing the pack and you don't know it. So my best advice is to be honest with yourself, to make sure you're really, in some unique sense, the only person at the bleeding edge of doing what you do. That doesn't mean it's the only way to succeed, but you asked me a very precise question, is what separates the 8-figure number from the guy who's going to become a young billionaire. It's the guy who's actually at the bleeding edge, not at the handle of the knife. And be honest with yourself. And the second thing I would say is, not everybody has the same God-given skills. In fact, by definition, I think every one of you has a different skill that you're uniquely endowed with that's different from the person sitting next to you. Be honest with yourself about what that skill is for you and the longer list of things that are not on that list, so that you can actually make sure that you're matching what you do with your own unique God-given talent. If you do that, avoid chasing the pack, go the other way, and you're right, sky's the limit, and you'll be beating me out by the time you're 39 years old. I'll tell you that. Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Hi. So I'm a freshman right now, and at the end of this school year, I plan to take a leave of absence to enlist in the Navy.
Thank you, my man.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And I love your shirt.
Thank you.
Faith over fear.
Yeah. So what could this election mean for me as a future service member and for the world as a whole?
So that's a very deeply personal question that we ought to think about when we think about foreign wars in the context of PowerPoint presentations versus the lives we're actually putting on the line. I think the single greatest way to stay out of World War III, which will fall on your generation's shoulders and very specifically possibly your shoulders, is to make sure that we have a strong commander-in-chief. And in my view, that's Donald Trump rather than Kamala Harris as the next president of the United States. And here's why, though. It's not just a Republican versus Democrat thing. This isn't a partisan politics thing. Because actually the Republican Party has been arguably as responsible as the Democratic Party for foreign misadventures over the last 25 years. Failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. $8 trillion of our national debt. We have a $35 trillion national debt. $8 trillion of that is attributable to those two wars that falls on your generation's shoulders. Not to mention we're talking about tens of thousands of American lives sacrificed in each of those. and 30,000 more if you count the suicides after for people who served in both of those countries. So what's at stake in this election? If you're going to serve in the Navy, man, and I know you know this, you're making a sacrifice where you're saying that if our country depends on it, you are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, and I respect you for it. But it's the job of the leaders of the country to make sure that if, God forbid, we ever put our sons' and daughters' lives on the line, it better darn well be to protect the citizens of this country, not any other one. And I do think that's an obligation that we have to do a better job of keeping. All right, if I have anything to do with this, I promise to you we will keep that. Thank you. Thank you.
How's it going, Vivek?
Good.
First of all, I just want to thank you. I'm a big fan. I drove 4 hours to come see you.
Oh, thank you, man. I appreciate it.
I love how you just come here and you openly talk and have conversation, and that's really respectable, so thank you. My question is, how do we fix, if there is a solution to the mainstream corruption and dishonesty within media?
And a few friends in the room who might have some views on this, but so I'll tell you this is, it's top down and bottom up. Okay, the top down mother of all problems is actually the federal government itself. So this idea of big tech censorship, I don't use that word anymore because it's not big tech censorship, right? It's really government tech censorship, where the government has been using these tech companies as pawns censored through the back door what they otherwise could not actually censor through the front door under the U.S. Constitution. That's breaking the law, and I think that we need to hold many of those lawbreakers in the government accountable. That's different from, and I understand the conservative temptation at times to say, well, we're going to go after people in the media that are lying with misinformation and prosecute them. We're starting to hear some of that, and I get the frustration. That's what the left does, okay? We don't want a centralized arbiter of truth in the government, but what we haven't yet done as conservatives that we need to do is hold the lawbreakers accountable who are in the government itself, right? The people who are supposedly the high pastors of science who actually failed to follow science while censoring the core input to the scientific method, which is open debate, including on the internet. Same thing with respect to the Hunter Biden laptop story on the eve of the last election. The single greatest form of election interference, I think, in the history of Western elections that probably changed the outcome of the last presidential election. So I think that we have to hold those lawbreakers accountable, acknowledge that it is a violation of the law when the government censors speech indirectly that they couldn't censor directly. That's a failure. However, there's the bottom-up side of this. That only works if we have a culture and a populace and, frankly, a generation that's willing to buy what they're selling. Right? I think part of what's going on in the country right now is, as human beings, we're wired to bend the knee, actually. We're wired to want to believe in something bigger than us. And when we stop believing in our country or in family, faith, patriotism, hard work, belief in God disappears, something else is going to fill that void instead. I think that's what's going on with the climate ideology. It's really more of a substitute for a modern religion. And so you're always going to bend the knee to something. And I think the only way we're actually going to solve this censorship problem in a lasting way, oddly enough, is actually to fill that vacuum of purpose and self-confidence and meaning with the real thing. So combine that with, in the short term, hold the government actors accountable, but in the long run, make sure we have a population that is immunized, to borrow the priests of high science's favorite terms, immunized against that form of corruption. It's going to take both of those to save our country in a lasting way. So thank you. I appreciate it. Did you guys get to hear from Tony Bobulinski, by the way, or before? Okay, maybe later.
Vivek, thank you for being here. So I've heard you talk a little bit about the redundancy in government organizations such as like the FBI and the IRS. I just want to hear you maybe expand on why you feel that way.
Yeah, so I think that we have way too many people who work in the federal government, and there's a myth right now that we all somehow abide. We all nod our heads and pretend like we live in a country where the people we elect to run the government are the ones who run the government. Actually, that was what our founding fathers envisioned, certainly. It's what we tell ourselves what it means to live in a democracy. You vote for your leaders. If they do a bad job, you vote them out. If they do a good job, you vote them back in. That's democracy. We don't live really in that democracy. Like, not in any palpable sense of that word. Most of the laws that affect what you can and can't do in your life were never passed by the people we elected. And even more so, they were not even passed by people who could be removed by the people who were elected. They were written by unelected bureaucrats. Now, they don't call them laws, they call them rules, but it has the effect of law. They were never elected and couldn't even be removed by the people who were. That is a flagrant violation of the founding premise of the United States of America. And it isn't an accident. It's the old world rearing its ugly head again, where the old world vision was we the people could not be trusted to self-govern. Right? The idea that every person on November 5th is going to get a vote here in Pennsylvania and across the country, settle their differences at the ballot box, that was crazy talk back in old world England. The idea that you could express any opinion, no matter how heinous the opinion, that you get to express any opinion. That's nutty talk for most of human history. But that's, you're wearing a Make America Great Again hat? That's how we made America great the first time around, okay? And today, Republican or Democrat, let's be very honest about this, it's the elected officials, the people in the deep state, they just view them as cute little puppets that come along every few years. I was here before they arrived, and I'm going to be here long after they're gone. That's their attitude. You can't reform that through just incremental window dressing. If we're serious about this, and I hope we are, I think that Donald Trump is the best chance we will have, I think, in the next foreseeable modern American history to get this right. But even still, it's going to require a spine of steel to see this through. Winning the election doesn't secure this automatically. Reform does not work. But I think that actually cutting so much that you're also willing to cut some muscle along the way, that's what's going to be required if you actually really are serious about solving this problem. So 4 million federal bureaucrats. Everybody talks about the mass deportations of millions of illegal aliens from the country, and I'm in favor of that. And I can talk more about that if people have questions. But don't forget the second mass deportation that we need, which is the mass deportation of millions of unelected federal bureaucrats out of Washington, D.C. That is the heart of how we save our country, and that's why I believe it. Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
What's up, Vivek?
Good to see you, man.
Likewise. So, I saw you at Liberty University, hands up, worshiping God. Love it. But I did some research, and internet, Google, whatever, don't know if it's true, would love clarification, said that you are Hindu. Is that true? And if so, I'd love to hear about, your thoughts on Jesus and why you were worshiping at Liberty.
Sure, yeah. So it is not only on the internet, it is something that is in all 3 of my best-selling books. So I wrote Woke Inc. Chapter 2 is dedicated to my faith. I wrote a book that just came out, by the way, last month, topped the bestsellers. It's called Truths. The first chapter of Truths is God is Real. And on page 2 of that chapter, I describe my Hindu faith in detail. So I'll tell you the heart of my faith, and I was educated in Catholic school, so I can kind of give you some perspective on the shared value sets and the different theology between Hinduism and Christianity. My core faith is that there's one true God. He puts us here for a purpose, and it is our moral duty to realize that purpose. And because God resides in each of us, you should never treat somebody the way that you would not want to be treated in return, which to a Christian ear might sound familiar, and certainly does to me from my also years of going to St. X and understanding that the same, and why, so your question was why would I worship at Liberty? The way I view it from a Hindu faith perspective is that Jesus Christ is a Son of God, which is different than saying he is the Son of God. That's where the theology is different. But the value set is the same. The value set that you treat others as you wish to be treated, the idea that you're put here for a higher purpose, that it's not being done by you but through you, that's really what guided me to take the most important steps I have in my own life. It's incredibly important to me, and funny enough, there's a thread of it through American history as well. So John Adams, who was the second president of the United States, he actually became a Sanskrit and Hindu scholar after he left the White House, and he actually wrote about a lot of the parallels between Hindu values and Christian values in his famous letters to Thomas Jefferson, which actually guided a lot of my own views between my own faith and even the founding values of our country. So hope that answers your question, and I'd encourage you to, if you're interested in this, take a look at the books where I've talked about this in a lot greater detail. Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Vivek. I have a question for you. How do you feel about January 6th insurrection?
Well, I think first of all, even framing it that way, I think is already accepting a premise that we ought to not automatically just accept. I mean, I think that the reality is, when did that happen? It happened after a full year of censorship in this country. And my own view is if you tell people they cannot speak, that is when they scream. If you tell people they cannot scream, that is when they tear things down. In that whole year, we had locked down an entire country. Told you, shut up, sit down, do as you're told. Unless you're marching for BLM or Antifa, burning down cities from Portland to Minneapolis, then it's okay. COVID doesn't really matter then. But for the rest of it, shut up, sit down, do as you're told. If you say the virus that caused you to shut up, sit down, and do as you're told originated in a lab in China, you were a racist and a xenophobe. You were censored on social media if you said it. But then at least you get to settle this at the election, right? You have an election in 2020, except on the eve of that election, the fourth largest paper in circulation in the United States of America, founded by Alexander Hamilton, had its own Twitter account censored, where even if you were sending direct messages, not even public posts, but the equivalent of emails between one another, those themselves were silenced, which, according to polling afterwards, apparently had a clear impact on who won that presidential race. So there was a lot of pent-up frustration at that time. That being said, peace is the way in America. And part of the reason I'm a defender of free speech is I think free speech is not only part of the path to truth, it's also core to the path to peace in the United States as well. And I think that one of our learnings coming out of this is the government should just be open about mistakes that we've made along the way, areas where we haven't been transparent with the public. I think people are yearning for that. I think Kamala Harris has had a couple of opportunities where, even in Joe Biden had these too, where I was rooting for them to do the thing that probably was politically better for them too, but it was also better for the country, where if after that election, Joe Biden had addressed the nation and said, Donald Trump is despicable and I dislike his policies and that's why I ran against him, but he should still have the right to express himself. And I'm calling on our culture and our country and technology companies that we might have pressured before to say, we believe in free speech in America. I think that would have had a healing effect on this country. If somebody was serious about uniting this country, that's what he would have said in our hour of need. But I hope that at least let it be, if something positive comes out of it, let it be a national self-reflection to say, how are we going to avoid making the mistakes again that over a year culminated in an event that I wish hadn't happened, but wishing that away or scolding a handful of people isn't actually going to solve the underlying problem. But reckoning with it and admitting some of our government's failures along the way, and most importantly, making changes in the future, I think will make sure that we don't have a day like that again. Thank you, my man. Appreciate the question.
Hey, Vivek. I drove like 14 hours from Nova Scotia.
Oh, wow. Thank you, man.
To see you.
America's a great country, consider it sometime.
Yeah.
But thank you for coming, man.
I
appreciate
have
it.
dual citizenship, so I do plan to move here next year. Anyways.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. But I had a question like about the northern border. Like, I'm not sure if you're aware, but like last month there was that like Toronto resident who was planning like a terrorist attack in New York City. What do you think should be like done about it?
Yeah, people laughed at me at the presidential campaign for talking about this, even a lot of in the Republican Party. So I took a trip to the northern border of New Hampshire, and it was really interesting. It was like a fascinating trip where we went to one of the border crossing stations, high-level security, barbed wire fences. It's like a sign coming in from the Canadian side, do not enter, you will be prosecuted. And then like right under that, there's another sign that says, hiking trail this way. And so we like checked out the hiking trail. It's just like wide open in terms of whether or not you're able to cross. Now, would that be a big deal? Is that not everything can be the highest priority at the same time? Well, it turns out we've had more northern border crossings at places like that, 10x more in the last year than we've had in the average of the last 12 years. And just last year, enough fentanyl was captured, and this is just the amount we recovered at the northern border to kill 3 million Americans. So I do think this is a rising and serious issue. I think Republicans who laughed it off while I was, brought this issue up on the debate stage last year, I think are in some ways uncertain of whether they're trying to still sweeping this under the rug or taking this seriously. And I think a lot of the smarter criminals who understand, I gave the aspiring entrepreneur advice earlier, right? What did I tell him? If the pack is running one way, you run the other. Well, a lot of these criminals are pretty smart entrepreneurs, too, in the cartels. So they understand skating to where the puck is going. The pack is running to the southern border. But if you really want to get serious, if you really had ill intentions for the country, People might actually consider going to the northern border and crossing where it's wide open with far less security, and that's already starting to happen. Goes back to the question about the military. The young man who asked about the question of serving in the Navy. I think the first and most important job of the U.S. national defense complex is to actually, radical idea here, defend the United States of America and our own homeland, which we're failing to do today. So I take those responsibilities seriously for our government. And I think if we get the right outcome in this election that I'm rooting and fighting for, I think we're going to get it from our federal government finally as well. So thank you, man. I appreciate the question. Thank you. And thanks for making the drive. It's good to be here.
Hi, Vivek. I actually have a question about this election.
Sure.
So I believe that there are some voters out there who believe in Trump's policies and his ability to run this country and protect us from foreign wars, but they don't necessarily believe in his character or his diction. So what do you say to those voters?
Yeah, so what I say to those voters, we have a once-in-a-century opportunity. It's actually more than a once-in-a-century opportunity. The last time American voters had this opportunity was in 1888, when Grover Cleveland defeated Benjamin Harrison for the presidency. And that opportunity is one where you could compare the records of two different administrations side by side. Because usually what happens in American politics, it's kind of hard for the voter, where you've got an incumbent who's running with a record, and then you've got somebody who's promising you hopes and dreams, but you don't know if they're actually selling you the real thing. Here we have a unique opportunity we haven't had since 1888. We have the Trump administration, and we've got, we call it the Biden administration, but functionally we all know he wasn't the functioning U.S. president, effectively the Harris-Biden administration. Compare 4 years of each. Go down the list. Under Trump, prices stayed flat, wages went up. Under Harris-Biden, wages stayed flat, prices went up. Under Trump, we were nowhere near major conflict, de-escalated North Korea, no major wars. Here, major wars in the Middle East, in Ukraine, aggression from China with respect to Taiwan. We're closer to World War III than we've ever been in any of our lifetimes. Talk about the border. We were down to an all-time low of border crossings in 2019 under Trump's leadership. Over the last 4 years, we've had more illegal entry into the United States than in the entire history of the United States of America. So you go border, economy, proximity to World War III, rampant violent crime spreading across the country like an epidemic, and a deep loss of pride resulting from all of that. I would encourage those friends to pay, for the purpose of this election, let's just stipulate that you're not in this to marry either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. Okay, this is not the Bachelor or Bachelorette. This is an election where you're actually just electing the person who's not going to raise your kids in the household, who's not going to be your friend at the dinner table, but he's going to be the person who's going to make sure you have a better and safer and more prosperous and more secure life. And against that backdrop, I think the choice is as clear as it could be. I happen to think that, because I have a benefit that many voters don't, I've gotten to know Donald Trump pretty well over the last year. We've known each other for years, but very well this year. I actually do think that he embodies a strength of character that we need in a commander-in-chief, that actually does take deep personal risks that he doesn't have to be taken. And he wouldn't be prosecuted 4 times over if he wasn't running for U.S. president. And so I judge somebody not on the content of their tweets, but on the content of their actual character, which is the risks they take to do what they think is right. So I personally happen to reject the premise of the question, because I do think that Donald Trump is a man who has reflected his willingness to make a sacrifice for this country. But I know that's not going to persuade somebody who's already formed their own view on that. So what I would say is just compare the 4 years under Trump to the 4 years under Harris-Biden. On the axes I mentioned, the results are clear, and you're going to have a better life and a better upbringing, especially as a young person entering the workforce if Donald Trump's your next president. So thank you, man. Appreciate it.
You're going to hold it. Okay. Hey, Vivek.
Hey, good to see you. You got a lot of friends. I like that.
I do. I'm very popular. I just want to ask some questions. Like, wasn't your biotech company funded by George Soros?
No.
No?
Yeah.
Okay.
But there are things on the internet that say that. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Although I would give people some advice. If you want to get money at a good deal and it's arm's length, like if George Soros gave somebody a good deal for low cost of capital, I would say take it.
Yeah, you take it.
Donald Trump took his $160 million loan. People faulted him for that. I'd say, you know what? Be smart. But it so happens that just in this particular case wasn't factually true. Yeah.
Okay. We'll move on. I just want to point out, when you say you have this idea, you like to how do we put this?
Just out of respect to people before you, give me your best question and then we'll roll.
Yes, my best question. Okay. You like
That's all right,
to
don't
say-
be nervous,
You
yeah.
put this idea forward, and you like to think it triggers the libs on TikTok. You know, it triggers these people. It makes them angry. It makes them furious, and I just think it's very hypocritical when I could say the same thing back to you. I could say something like gender is not binary, and it would pull the same reaction among you or other people, right? And you. I'm getting to it. Thank you. And I just feel like there's some hypocrisy here where you. Holy shit, my brain's not working.
That's all right, and it got a lot of people in the room, and I get it. Let me just give. I asked people with challenging questions to come forward. Tell me the most hypocritical thing I've said, and let me address it.
Okay.
In your opinion, yeah.
Can I please hold the mic? Damn it. Okay. Okay, you put forward this idea that it makes people mad. It makes people furious. Yeah, I can say the same thing, and it makes your base just as mad. It makes them just as angry. You propagate this idea that you're the victim. You're the victim of censorship, this prosecution online, and like when you put this idea forward, it doesn't make me angry. It just makes me realize I'm talking to a dumbass, quite frankly.
Okay.
And I only get angry when it starts to hurt people. When it starts to people get killed, people get, people's lives are ended.
Okay.
That's when I get angry.
So look, I'm always on a mission to, because I don't think we advance our dialogue. We got to find the best possible argument for the other side. I'm going to take a minute because this one makes it a little bit harder to do that. But I think if part of the question is, let's just sort of is part of the point, do you want to own the other side and defeat them? Or do you actually want to lead one country? That's maybe the heart of a positive framing of your question.
Well, I think you're very unified.
Yeah. Well, I believe that the United States of America is actually still one United States of America. All right? And the reason I say the things that I do is that they're my beliefs. I believe there are two genders. I believe that the climate change agenda is a hoax. I believe that reverse racism is racism. I believe that an open border is not a border. I believe that parents should be the one that determine the education of their children. So those are controversial things to say. The nuclear family is not a bad word. It's the greatest form of governance. But the reason I say those things is not to make somebody else angry. But the reason I say those things is because I believe they are true. And the way I believe we're going to save our country is that even if you disagree with me, I will fight to the death for your right to say it. Because that's what America was founded on. And so, it's a hard thing to do, but we're still the country where we can disagree like hell and get together at the dinner table at the end of it. That is the America I actually grew up in. I miss that. I know you're nervous. The best advice I would give you next time is when you resort to, name calling, it actually does a disservice to an otherwise interesting and important point you have an opportunity to make, and I would just encourage you to dig deep and get to the heart of what's really, I think you're somebody who probably cares about national unity, actually. I think you're actually somebody who's motivated by not dividing this country. And I know it's hard to sort of confront somebody you disagree with, but just leave the epithets out next time, and it will make your own argument more credible. Thank you, my man. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. You had your chance, and I want to be respectful to the people behind you. Thank you, my man.
Hey, Vivek. Hey. How's your wife, Purva, and your kids?
They're doing well, thank you. A little busy.
A little busy?
Yeah.
So the question I have for you today is, there were a lot of controversial things happening in campus last week and last week regarding the war in Palestine and Israel. So I was wondering, what would be your solution? If you were president today, because you were also running, what would you do to fix that?
So I think actually a lot of what we're seeing on the global stage in terms of chaos from Ukraine to Israel to even what we're seeing in the South China Sea, what people are now ignoring, is actually just a function of weak leadership. So if you have a strong leader who's willing to have open dialogue to be able to actually get to what actually matters for each side of a debate, you're actually going to smoke out a lot more than you're going to do it by hiding in a basement, which we're getting out of the current White House. My own view is Israel is an ally of the United States, and it's important that we stand diplomatically for Israel's right to defend itself, because if the United States were hit at our own southern border, I wouldn't want another country telling me what I can and cannot do if I'm the U.S. president. And for an ally, I got to give them the same respect to say if somebody hits them on their southern border, they have the full sovereignty, right, and responsibility to defend their own sovereign existence. And I think that allowing Israel the ability to assess the right risks and responses fully on its own with the diplomatic support of the United States to say that not the UN or the US is going to stand in your way, I think that's the right way to actually handle it. And I think, frankly, if you had a stronger president, Hamas would have never done what it did on October 7th in the first place, and that's the best solution to make sure this doesn't happen again. Thank you, my man. I appreciate it.
Hello, Vivek. My name is Michael, and I just want to say I supported you in your campaign, sir. And
I appreciate it.
I've been a follower of yours since you were on Michael Knowles' podcast. And my question for you, sir, is kind of related to restoring government trust. I plan on having a career in politics, and you have talked about multiple times before the idea of the government needs to let go of some of the secrets, the open secrets that they have held before to kind of regain trust somewhat with the population. Is that still a belief that you hold, that the government should, and could you go into a little bit more detail of how you would do that?
Yeah,
sir?
look, so I think there's a difference when, I have to be very frank with you, I think there's a difference when I'm running as the candidate representing my own views versus a different hat that I wear right now, which is to help support Donald Trump win and govern successfully over the next several years. But when I was running for U.S. president, I'll tell you what I said. I think there should be no filter on what the government does or does not share with the public, because that actually builds trust in the long run. When you don't tell the public an uncomfortable truth, you could talk about the origin of COVID. You could talk about a lot of what happened under J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. Some of that's recent, some of that's a long time ago. It doesn't matter. When you fail to tell people the actual truth, because you worry that that might cause them to see the government conspiratorially, it's actually having a counterintuitive impact. People, when they're not told the truth, will imagine something even far worse than what the reality might have been. So it's self-defeating. And I think part of living in a true self-governing republic is you have a government that just tells the people the truth. It's a radical idea, but if we do, I actually think that we'd be more united as a country. We'd improve public trust in our government. And I think it's also what we're entitled to as we, the people who create a government that's accountable to us rather than the other way around. So am I a hardliner on government transparency with citizens? You're darn right I am. And do I believe that putting Donald Trump back in the White House is going to be a positive step in that direction? Yes, I do. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Hi, Vivek. As someone who has come across brainwashed leftists on campus, one of the moments my friends and I have seen them the most brainwashed is when it comes to climate change. Last year, around this time, we set up a table on campus, dressed up as Captain Planet, encouraging students to sign a petition banning dihydrogen monoxide, better known as water, to combat climate change. On its face, it sounds like a waste of time, but we ended up getting over 100 signatures to ban water. As someone who views himself as a conservationist, how do we get people to stop using climate change as a buzzword and start having serious conversations on how to address serious environmental disasters that everyday Americans face?
Yeah, well, that was clever. I'm tempted to go down a rabbit hole here that I don't want to go too deep into. I actually do talk about this in the book. That's actually less crazy than much of the climate change advocacy, because carbon dioxide as a percentage of the atmosphere is like 0.04%. And we're actually at the lowest, almost lowest, one of the lowest amounts of carbon dioxide as a percentage of the global atmosphere than we've ever been in the history of the Earth. And most of the times when you had a higher percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you actually had ice ages. So this idea, and by the way, in the 1970s, that's what they were worried about. So guys, look this up back when, there was these things in America that used to be called magazines. They were printed and they were paper and they would come to your house every week. So Newsweek would come once a week, Time Magazine would come once a week. Cover of Time Magazine and Newsweek was Ice Planet. Yeah, this young man remembers that. You're in elementary school. So you were around for the age of the magazines. But literally, this is a big deal. Cover magazine of Time and Newsweek is that there's a global ice age coming unless we stop burning CO2. So this is what they said. This is not that long ago. Okay, it's like 50 years ago. And then they said, wait a minute. Actually, we're not entering an ice age. Maybe it's the opposite problem. Maybe we're just overwarming the planet. So let me just, jokes aside, let's just break this question down. Hard facts, hard truths. Are global surface temperatures going up? Contrary to what the scientists in the 1970s predicted if we said we'd have a global ice age. No, they were actually wrong. Global surface temperatures are going up by a little bit. Is that directly due to man-made activity of some kind? I think the correlation is strong enough that the answer to that is probably. Is that directly due to carbon dioxide? Far from certain. Actually, to the contrary, you could have reasons to believe it was other gases, maybe even gaseous H2O, funny enough, as to bring that full circle, or other forces in the atmosphere that we don't recognize. But the most important question that nobody asks, and this one is, it frustrates a lot of climate activists when I mention this, but it is the question we ought to ask, is, do we have any evidence to suggest that that small increase in global surface temperatures, even if it is man-made, is at all a bad thing on net for humanity? It's actually an interesting question because there's actually some strong arguments to be made that this is a positive thing for humanity. 8 times as many people die of cold temperatures rather than warm ones, and yet we're setting a global policy agenda to make sure that we have cooler temperatures when 8 times as many people die of cold temperatures. Another interesting fact, the Earth is more covered by green surface area today than it was a century ago because carbon dioxide is plant food. It's actually an intake for plants, and plants tend to grow in slightly warmer global surface temperatures. So you could go straight down the list in a lot of ways where the effects of this kind of climate change has some positive effects and arguably even net positive effects for humanity, which is why it makes no sense to go out of our way to destroy access to abundant, plentiful, cheap energy, which is the best way to prevent all temperature-related deaths. Like you, I am a conservationist. I believe in clean air and clean water. I believe in preserving the beautiful country of the United States of America, including in our national parks. And it's a shame because that environmentalist movement has been co-opted and bastardized by viewing the entire environmental agenda through this prism of a really religious cultish movement of climate change, which I think is actually just a substitute for religion in modern America, and that's a deeper conversation we can have later. Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Hi, Vivek. So my question for you is that as a person who's owned a biotech company, I'm sure you're aware of how broken our healthcare system is, from the FDA to insurance companies. What is the specific solution that you think as a country we should take to fix this system?
Yeah, so look, I think that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution here. I mean, I would love to tell you there's some kind of magic pill or silver bullet. It doesn't work that way. That being said, it kind of goes back to the earlier question about transparency with the people. Our government has not been transparent with the people about the effects of exactly how you got to the food pyramid propagated by the USDA, how you've exactly gotten to which drugs the FDA does or doesn't choose to approve, often on the basis of, I think, poor criteria that are often the subject of regulatory capture. And so my own view is you want to bring down the cost of prescription drugs, the best way to do it is introduce competition. I believe in medical choice in both directions. And I think this is at least a starting point as a principle. It's not the end-all be-all, but it's a starting point as a principle. Just because the FDA or the government has approved something does not mean you should ever be forced to take it. But just because the FDA has not approved something doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to take it. And right now we've got it backwards on both counts. I think part of this is also downstream of this mental health epidemic in our own country. I think the loss of our physical health is downstream of the loss of our mental fortitude and psychic fortitude as a country. We're lost. I think the internet generation has a big part to do with it. The state of lethargy, the state of believing that you're just moving through the aimless passage of time has actually contributed to the overgrowth of the obesity and diabetes epidemic in this country. And a lot of this, we don't want it to be top down from the government. A lot of this is going to have to be bottom up for a citizenry that regains this thing that we call virtue that we've in some ways lost in our postmodern environment. So that's what I believe longer, could have a full day-long discussion about it, but those are some first principles I'd give you out of the gate. Thank you, man. We got one final question? Oh. Yeah, right here. Yeah.
Sorry. So Penn State alumni, so proud of everyone in this room that's blue and white. And my one question is, we're 19 days from the eve of the election, actually the results. And what can everyone in this room do across the next 19 days that want to make a difference?
Great. And this is not an idle conversation in Pennsylvania, all right? I know the window for registering for voting, well, you know what? It ends Monday, I believe, in Pennsylvania. Register to vote and get as many people who care about the future of the country who are legally able to do so to do the same thing, to actually show up. So I'm supporting Donald Trump, but I think one of the things that's going to propel the right outcome in this election is a lot of people who have never voted or actually turning out to vote. That's essential in this election. And you want to know what? It's because your own lives are going to be the ones that are actually impacted by it. If you're looking at graduating from college, who do you want in office that ensures you're going to have an economy where you're able to earn more money rather than less? Who do you actually want to make sure doesn't send you to fight in some foreign war with somebody else's gun over your shoulder? Who do you want to make sure that actually looks after, if you have college debt, you're actually going to be able to pay that off with an economy that's growing rather than shrinking? An illegal mass migration crisis in this country that's rampantly spreading like an epidemic in every major city from Pennsylvania to the West Coast. That's going to be Donald Trump. That directly affects your actual fate in this country, but that's not somebody else's job. So the three things you can do is, right now, register to vote. Get as many people as you can around you from your friend group, your family, your parents, and for those of you who have kids, for your kids who are over 18 as well. Register as many as you can. On November 5th, actually show up. And then for the Republicans in the room, I got a special challenge for you, which is that we, myself included, don't love this concept of early voting. Like, I'm not into it. I think we need single-day voting on Election Day as a national holiday with paper ballots, government-issued ID, and English as the sole language that appears on a ballot. But to the Republicans in the room, if you're like me, I got a challenge for you, which is that we got to win so decisively in this election that a landslide minus some shenanigans is still a victory. In order to get there, that will require us to do something that we are otherwise not into doing, which is actually, who knows, with hurricane, storm, what's going to be going on in your own life. This time around, vote early so we can actually get this right for the future. That's my challenge to the Republicans in this room. And then finally, when you're the only person, especially on a college campus, when you're the only person in a room who believes what you do, right now more than ever, I'm asking you in the next 20 days to stand up and actually say it. Say it with a spine. Say it with conviction. Say it with respect. But part of respect is that you respect your fellow neighbor enough to tell him what you actually think, not some fake woke-washed version of it. We've had a culture of fear in this country, but you know what? Courage can be contagious too. It just requires more of us to actually show it. And if you're willing to do that, to make that small sacrifice, it is a sacrifice, but it's a small sacrifice compared to the founding fathers I talked about in the beginning. There are 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. 12 of them had their homes ransacked and burned to the ground by the British before their deaths. 5 of them were captured by the British and tortured until their deaths. 9 of them died in the American Revolution. 3 more of them had their own kids die in the American Revolution. They didn't do it for them. They did it for us so we could be here 250 years later enjoying the blessings of liberty in, however flawed we may be, still the greatest nation known to the history of mankind. And I implore you, do not be a part of the generation that after all these years finally squanders what we've been given. This election is our chance to actually save it. We are in the middle of I don't say this lightly, we are in the middle of a war in this country. Our enemy is not our fellow citizen, it is an ideology. But there is no middle ground here between merit and group quotas. You cannot have both. Pick one. Between free speech and censorship. You cannot have both. Pick one. Between American exceptionalism and American apologism. You cannot have both. Pick one. That's what you have a chance to do between now and November 5th. Not only on November 5th, but between now and November 5th. That will require a sacrifice of your time. You got exams. You got stuff to study for. You got the possibility that your friend may look at you a little bit differently if you're encouraging him to register to vote and telling him to vote for Donald Trump. Well, if our founding fathers could take those risks, I'm asking you to take those risks too. And if you do, my promise to you is this. We don't have to be this nation in decline. The nation you all have grown up in for the entirety of your lives has been a nation in decline. We don't have to be this nation in decline. We still can be a nation in our ascent. And I believe it's going to take people like you in this room whose best days in life are still ahead of you to see a country whose best days are still ahead of itself too. It's not your generation or even mine that's going to save this country. It's going to be your generation that saves this country. You have a chance to shock the political class. Most of them say, hey, your generation doesn't vote, and if you do, you're not going to show up to vote for the side that I'm on. Well, you have a chance to actually completely subvert that narrative and change the course of American history in the next 20 days. Be contrarian and be right. That's what I said. Said it in the context of business. Well, now I say it in the context of saving our country. And if you do your part, we will then look your kids in the eye and tell them this is still the country where you still get ahead with your own hard work and commitment and dedication, and that you know what? You are free to speak your mind at every step of the way. That is the American dream, and that is what we're going to revive as of the morning of November 6th after you all do your job in the next 20 days. Thank you. God bless you and your families, and may God bless our United States of America. Don't stop fighting until we get this job done, guys. Thank you. Thank you. God bless. Thank you. Thank you, man.
Seeing for